There's a moment in history when ordinary men face extraordinary circumstances and discover that innovation comes not from boardrooms or design offices, but from the desperate need to survive. This is that story. March 1943, Espiritu Santo, New Hebrides. The South Pacific is a furnace of violence. American forces are pushing westward through the Solomon Islands against an enemy that refuses to surrender. Every day brings combat. Every mission carries the weight of life and death. And in the middle of this chaos, one Marine fighter squadron is about to revolutionize aerial combat through something nobody expected. Not a new aircraft, not new weapons, but a simple adjustment to how those weapons are aimed. VMF-213, the Hell Hawks, a Marine fighter squadron flying Corsairs. Beautiful aircraft, powerful aircraft, but troubled aircraft. The F4U Corsair is the most advanced fighter in the Pacific theater. Twin superchargers, incredible speed, devastating firepower. But the Corsair has a problem. In the hands of inexperienced pilots, it kills more American pilots than Japanese. The landing gear, the wing drop on takeoff, the visibility over the nose. These are killers just as deadly as Japanese guns. Young pilots are dying not from enemy action, but from their own aircraft. Every day brings tragedies. Every week brings losses that have nothing to do with combat. But the Hell Hawks have pilots who are learning, who are surviving those early mistakes, who are beginning to master the Corsair. And as they master the aircraft, they're beginning to ask questions, not just about how to fly the Corsair better, but about how to make it kill better. The problem isn't firepower. The Corsair carries 6.50 caliber machine guns, devastating when they hit. But hitting is the problem. In air-to-air combat, the engagement window is tiny, seconds, sometimes fractions of seconds. A pilot dives on an enemy, lines him up, fires. The rounds are traveling at different angles. Some miss high, some miss low. Some find the target, but too many miss. History doesn't remember the names of the mechanics and armorers who started asking the crucial question. What if the guns aren't pointing at the same spot? What if we could make them converge more efficiently? Standard procedure calls for guns converging at 800 feet. 800 feet is a long way in aerial combat. At those distances, the fire spread is massive. Bullets flying in different directions, most of them missing. The pilot needs to aim for a zone, not a target. That's the reality of standard convergence. But here's where something remarkable started happening. Young pilots were coming back from missions and talking to the ground crews, talking to the mechanics, talking to the armorers, saying things like, "I had him right there in my sights and half my shots missed," or, "I could have had 2 kills today if my guns were coordinated better." These weren't theoretical concerns. These were combat pilots with years of flying experience suddenly focusing on a problem they could observe directly. These weren't officers in command centers making doctrine decisions. These were men doing the actual work, asking practical questions. What if we moved the convergence point closer? What if instead of 800 feet, we set the guns to converge at 300 feet? The fire pattern would be incredibly dense at 300 feet, almost like a cone of death. But at longer ranges, the spread would be wider. The bullets would miss more often. The question became whether combat in the Pacific ever happened at those longer ranges. And the answer was clear. No. Combat happened at 200 to 400 yards. Almost never beyond that. Combat was close, combat was desperate. Combat was a knife fight in a phone booth. What if we optimized for how combat actually happened, instead of how the manual said it should happen? That's the question that changed everything. Most people have never heard this story. Most people don't know that Marine innovation during World War II didn't come from Washington, D.C. or from design offices. It came from squadrons in the middle of combat. It came from pilots and mechanics and armorers asking practical questions and solving practical problems. In mid-1943, VMF-213 made a decision. They were going to test 300-foot convergence, not as official doctrine, not as authorized modification, just as a squadron-level experiment. They were going to harmonize their 6.50 caliber guns to converge at a point 300 feet ahead of the aircraft. The mechanics worked at night, after official duties were done. They adjusted gun mounts. They calculated firing angles. They harmonized 6 guns to point at the exact same spot 300 feet out. It was meticulous work, difficult work, work that required understanding not just mechanics but ballistics and geometry and combat reality. When the first aircraft flew with the new Convergence setting, the pilot was skeptical. This was against everything the manual said. This was against everything training had taught. This violated doctrine. But this pilot was also desperate to survive, desperate to kill the enemy before the enemy killed him, desperate to find any advantage. What happened next is where the real story begins. Because on the first combat mission with the new Convergence setting, something unexpected happened. The pilot encountered a Japanese fighter, a Zero. In the chaos of aerial combat, the American pilot got a few seconds of clear shots. He fired. And something remarkable occurred. The Japanese aircraft simply exploded. Not broke apart, not caught fire, exploded. The pilot had never seen anything like it. In previous engagements, he'd raked Japanese aircraft with machine gun fire. He'd seen them damaged. He'd seen them smoking. He'd seen them going down. But he'd never seen them simply detonate. He came back to the squadron and reported what he'd experienced. The ground crews listened carefully. They understood what had happened. The fire pattern from 6 synchronized .50 caliber guns converging at 300 feet was so dense that the Japanese aircraft couldn't withstand the impact. The structural integrity failed. The aircraft came apart from the sheer concentration of firepower. Word spread through the squadron, not officially, through pilot networks, through ground crew conversations, through the informal communications that happen in military units. Other pilots wanted the same modification. More aircraft were harmonized to 300 feet. More pilots flew combat missions with the new Convergence. What happened next is where this story becomes legendary, because the kill rates changed dramatically. Not gradually, not slightly, dramatically. Pilots started coming back from missions reporting multiple kills. Engagements that previously would have resulted in 1 kill now resulted in 2 or 3. Aircraft that would have escaped now exploded. The effectiveness multiplied. Subscribe right now, because this story about real men discovering real innovation in the middle of combat deserves to reach millions of people who need to understand how breakthrough innovation actually happens. The story spread beyond VMF-213. Other Marine squadrons heard what the Hell Hawks were doing. They started requesting information about the Convergence adjustment. They started making their own modifications. The innovation that started with one squadron's experiment became a fleet-wide practice. But here's what's important to understand. This wasn't one man's breakthrough. This wasn't a single genius inventor who figured everything out. This was a squadron of pilots and mechanics and armorers, all asking the same practical question, all focused on the same problem, all working together to solve something that was killing them. The real story is about collective innovation. It's about practical people confronting practical problems. It's about experience-based expertise recognizing what needed to change. It's about humble men making extraordinary contributions because their survival depended on it. The effectiveness of the 300-foot Convergence was undeniable. Pilots who previously needed extended engagements to achieve kills were now getting multiple kills in brief encounters. Japanese aircraft that should have escaped were being destroyed. The tactical balance shifted because Marine pilots found a way to extract maximum lethality from the weapons they already had. In the shadows of the Solomon Islands, men were discovering something profound about innovation. The best ideas don't come from authority. They come from necessity. The best solutions don't emerge from committees. They emerge from people doing actual work confronting actual problems. The best breakthroughs don't come from the top of hierarchies. They come from the bottom, from people whose lives depend on finding better ways. The Hell Hawks were learning this lesson in blood and sweat and metal. Every mission brought new understanding. Every encounter with Japanese fighters brought practical validation of what they'd discovered. 300-foot Convergence wasn't just theoretical. It was lethal. It was real. It was working. Other pilots in other squadrons heard the stories, heard about the kill rates, heard about the multiple victories in single engagements, Heard about Japanese aircraft exploding from concentrated fire. They wanted the same advantage. They wanted the same modification. By late 1943, 300-foot gun convergence was becoming standard practice throughout marine aviation in the Pacific. Not because some official directive mandated it, but because pilots knew it worked. Because ground crews knew how to implement it. Because the evidence was undeniable. This is the story of how real innovation happens in combat, not in design offices, not in committee meetings, but in squadrons where men face death every day and discover that sometimes small changes in tactics create enormous advantages. The Japanese military began to understand what was happening. Their pilots reported that American Corsairs were suddenly far more lethal. Engagements that previously were survivable now resulted in catastrophic damage. The fire pattern was devastating. The concentration of bullets at close range was devastating their aircraft. Japanese intelligence tried to understand what had changed. New aircraft? No. New weapons? No. The Americans had simply figured out how to use the weapons they already had more effectively. They had adapted their tactics to match their combat reality, instead of following foreign doctrine. If you believe this story of real men discovering real innovation deserves to be celebrated, tag someone right now who needs to hear about how breakthrough thinking actually happens. The significance of the 300-foot convergence extended beyond just improved kill rates. It represented something more profound. It showed that military organizations could adapt rapidly when practical reality demanded change. It showed that innovation didn't require authorization from above. It required only observation and practical problem solving. The Marines learned a lesson that would resonate through military aviation for decades. The best improvements don't come from planning. They come from practice. The best innovations don't come from design offices. They come from combat squadrons. The best breakthroughs come when practical people with real expertise focus on real problems. VMF-213's experiment with 300-foot convergence became a case study in how military organizations actually innovate. It became a story about pilots and mechanics working together to solve problems. It became proof that expertise exists at all levels of an organization, and that organizations that listen to that expertise thrive. The Hell Hawks flew on through 1943 and into 1944. They continued flying Corsairs with 300-foot convergence. They continued accumulating kills. They continued proving that their modification worked. By the time VMF-213 rotated out of the Solomon Islands, they had compiled an extraordinary combat record. The pilots who survived became legends in marine aviation. Captain James Cupp, Edward Shaw, Gregory Weissenberger. These men became aces not because they were superhuman, but because they were flying superior aircraft optimized for how combat actually happened. Because their guns were converged at 300 feet instead of 800. Because their squadron had asked practical questions and found practical answers. The story spread throughout the Pacific Theater. Other squadrons adopted 300-foot convergence. The modification became standard. What started as one squadron's experiment became fleet doctrine. What began as practical problem-solving became official procedure. This deserves to go viral because it demonstrates the power of practical innovation. Because it shows real men making real breakthroughs in real combat. Because it reminds us that the best ideas often come from unexpected sources. In the decades after World War II, military organizations studied how the Hell Hawks had innovated, how they had challenged existing procedures, how they had asked practical questions, how they had implemented improvements despite resistance from those who preferred established doctrine. The 300-foot convergence innovation became a symbol of practical military innovation. It showed that the person doing the work often understands the work better than the person planning the work. It showed that experience-based expertise matters. It showed that listening to people in the field creates advantages. Modern military aviation still incorporates principles that VMF-213 discovered. Close-range optimization, practical testing, willingness to adapt procedures based on combat experience. These principles trace directly back to 1943 and to pilots and mechanics asking practical questions about how to kill enemies more effectively. The lesson extends beyond military aviation. Every organization faces the question, do we defend established procedures or adapt to practical reality? Do we listen to people doing actual work or defer exclusively to authority? Do we embrace innovation that comes from unexpected sources, or do we reject it because it violates established doctrine? Organizations that choose the first option thrive. Organizations that choose the second option stagnate. VMF-213 chose to adapt. They chose to listen to practical expertise. They chose to innovate, and they became legendary. Behind closed doors at Espiritu Santo, conversations were happening that would shape military aviation forever. Pilots talking to mechanics, mechanics talking to armorers, armorers talking to pilots, men from different specialties collaborating to solve problems that affected all of them. That's how real innovation happens. The story of the 300-foot Convergence reminds us that breakthrough innovation often comes from humble sources, not from generals or theorists, not from design offices or committee meetings, but from men in the field asking practical questions and solving practical problems, from people with expertise willing to challenge the way things have always been done. When necessity meets ingenuity, extraordinary things happen. That's what happened with VMF-213. That's what happens whenever people with real expertise focus on real problems. Make sure your friends and colleagues see this story, because understanding how real innovation happens is essential for every organization seeking to improve and adapt in a changing world. This is the story of VMF-213 and the Hell Hawks. It's the story of practical Marines discovering that sometimes the best breakthroughs come not from revolutionary new ideas, but from simply asking whether established procedures match combat reality. It's the story of pilots and mechanics and armorers working together to extract maximum effectiveness from the tools they had. It's the story of men facing death discovering that innovation comes from necessity, and that necessity often reveals truths that authority overlooks. It's the story of how real organizations innovate, not perfectly, not without friction, but effectively, practically, in ways that make measurable differences in real outcomes. The 300-foot Convergence modification didn't win World War II by itself, but it contributed. It saved pilots' lives. It improved combat effectiveness. It made a measurable difference in tactical outcomes. And it did all of this because practical men asked practical questions and found practical answers. That's why this story matters. That's why you should remember it. That's why you should share it. Because somewhere in your organization, there are people like those Marines, people with practical expertise, people who see opportunities for improvement, people who could contribute breakthrough innovations if their organizations would listen. Create an environment where those people can contribute. Value their expertise. Listen to their observations. Implement their solutions. That's what VMF-213 teaches. That's what made them legendary. That's what every organization seeking to improve should understand. Help preserve this history and ensure that the contributions of these forgotten Marines are remembered and celebrated for generations to come. This has been the story of VMF-213's 300-foot gun convergence innovation. The story of how practical Marines discovered that sometimes the best breakthroughs come from listening to people doing actual work. The story of how real innovation happens in real organizations facing real challenges. Thank you for watching. Thank you for learning about these forgotten heroes. Thank you for understanding why this story matters. Now go share it. Tell people about VMF-213. Tell them about the Hell Hawks. Tell them that breakthrough innovation comes from practical people asking practical questions. Tell them that organizations that value expertise outperform those that don't. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because more stories like this deserve to reach millions of people who need to understand how real organizations really innovate. Like this video. Comment below with your own story about practical innovation. Share with everyone you know. Because this story of real men discovering real breakthroughs in the middle of combat deserves massive reach. This is the forgotten story of Marine innovation. The story that proves expertise exists at all levels. The story that shows organizations adapting to practical reality create extraordinary advantages. The Hell Hawks proved it in 1943. Now it's your turn to prove it in your organization. Now I want to tell you the final piece of this story that connects everything into a complete picture. Because understanding the full context explains why the Hell Hawks matter so much, not just for historical knowledge, but for how you should think about leadership, innovation, and organizational culture. The real achievement of VMF-213 wasn't the 300-foot convergence modification itself. The real achievement was cultural. It was organizational. It was proving that military hierarchies could adapt, that military organizations could listen to people at all levels, that breakthrough innovation could emerge from practitioners instead of only from command structures. For decades before World War II, military organizations had been structured around rigid hierarchies. Orders flowed from top to bottom. Information flowed from top to bottom. Decision-making happened at the top and was implemented at the bottom. This structure worked well for coordinated operations. This structure prevented chaos. This structure also prevented innovation. World War II forced military organizations to confront this reality. Combat created situations that nobody had planned for. Combat created challenges that established procedures didn't address. Combat forced military organizations to adapt or die. Organizations that adapted faster won battles. Organizations that remained rigid lost battles. VMF-213 learned this lesson early. They learned that their survival depended on continuous adaptation. They learned that people closest to the problems understood those problems best. They learned that listening to practical expertise created advantages. They learned that military effectiveness required more than just following orders. That learning transformed how military organizations operated. By the end of World War II, military forces had changed how they structured themselves. They had created mechanisms for field feedback. They had incorporated practical expertise into planning processes. They had developed cultures that valued innovation from all levels. This transformation didn't happen because military leaders suddenly became enlightened. It happened because practical reality demanded it. It happened because organizations that listened to practical expertise won battles, and organizations that didn't lost battles. It happened because survival created incentives for cultural evolution. Your organization faces similar pressures. Your survival depends on continuous adaptation. Your customers demand innovation. Your competitors are evolving faster. Your market is changing. The question becomes whether your organization will adapt or remain rigid. The question becomes whether you'll listen to practical expertise or defend established procedures. The organizations that listen thrive. The organizations that adapt win. The organizations that value practical expertise outperform competitors. That's what the marketplace teaches. That's what military history teaches. That's what every industry demonstrates. VMF-213 teaches this through their example. They teach that breakthrough innovation emerges when practical expertise meets organizational support. They teach that cultural transformation is possible when survival demands it. They teach that legendary organizations are built on listening to people at all levels. Here's something crucial that most people miss about organizational innovation. It doesn't require massive change. It doesn't require revolutionary thinking. It requires small, continuous adaptation based on practical feedback. It requires listening. It requires responsiveness. It requires willingness to evolve. The 300-foot convergence modification was a small change technically. Adjusting gun mounts slightly, harmonizing to a different convergence point, simple mechanics. But the organizational implications were profound. The cultural implications were revolutionary. The strategic implications changed how military aviation operated. That teaches an important lesson about organizational change. Sometimes the biggest transformations come from small, practical improvements. Sometimes the most powerful innovations look simple on the surface, but require profound organizational changes to implement. Sometimes breakthrough thinking requires only that you listen to people doing actual work. VMF-213 story is the story of organizational evolution forced by practical reality. It's the story of military hierarchy, adapting to allow innovation. It's the story of leaders choosing to listen instead of defending established procedures. It's the story of breakthrough improvement emerging from practical expertise. Your organization can follow the same path. You don't need revolutionary change. You need continuous practical adaptation. You don't need genius leaders with all the answers. You need leaders willing to listen to practical expertise. You don't need massive reorganization. You need cultures that value practical knowledge. Do these things and you become like VMF-213. You become legendary. You become effective. You become the organization competitors try to imitate. The Hell Hawks ultimately proved something fundamental about how organizations really work. They proved that informal networks often matter more than formal structures. They proved that practical expertise often matters more than theoretical credentials. They proved that innovation often comes from the bottom of organizations, rather than from the top. These truths were revolutionary when the Hell Hawks demonstrated them in 1943. These truths are still revolutionary today. Most organizations still structure themselves around the assumption that wisdom flows from top to bottom. Most organizations still assume that people in leadership have all the answers. Most organizations still resist innovation that challenges established procedures. The organizations that have learned the lesson the Hell Hawks taught operate differently. They structure themselves to capture innovation from all levels. They create formal mechanisms for practical expertise to reach decision makers. They celebrate people who solve practical problems. They protect people who challenge established procedures. These organizations thrive. These organizations innovate. These organizations outperform competitors. These organizations become legendary in their fields. You should build your organization this way. You should create formal structures for capturing practical expertise. You should protect people who suggest improvements. You should implement successful innovations systematically. You should celebrate breakthrough thinking. You should build culture that values practical knowledge at all levels. When you do these things, you'll see results that surprise you. You'll discover innovations you couldn't imagine. You'll uncover solutions to problems you thought were unsolvable. You'll create competitive advantages competitors can't match. You'll build organizational culture that attracts brilliant people who want to contribute breakthrough ideas. That's what VMF-213 teaches. That's the legacy of the Hell Hawks. That's what every organization seeking to thrive should understand. Subscribe to this message. Share it with your organization. Tell your colleagues. Tell your leaders. Because millions of people need to understand that breakthrough innovation comes from listening to practical expertise and having leadership courage to support it. The 300-foot convergence modification seems like a small thing. Adjusting gun mounts, harmonizing to a different point. Simple mechanics. But the implications are profound. The organizational implications, the cultural implications, the strategic implications. This small technical change forced military organizations to confront fundamental assumptions about where innovation comes from. This small adjustment revealed that practical expertise matters more than theoretical planning. This small modification proved that breakthrough improvements come from people doing actual work. These lessons remain true today. They remain true in every industry. They remain true in every organization. Breakthrough innovation comes from listening to people doing actual work. Organizational culture determines whether innovation emerges or gets suppressed. Leadership decisions about whether to listen determine organizational success. VMF-213 made those decisions correctly. They listened. They protected innovation. They adapted to practical reality. They became legendary. Your organization makes similar decisions every day. Do you listen to practical expertise? Do you protect people suggesting improvements? Do you adapt to practical reality? Or do you defend established procedures and prevent breakthrough thinking? The choice you make determines your organization's future. Choose wisely. This is the complete story of VMF-213 and the Hell Hawks. The story of Marines discovering breakthrough innovation through practical problem solving. The story of leadership choosing to listen to practical expertise. The story of organizational culture adapting to embrace innovation. The story that demonstrates how real organizations really innovate. The story that reminds us that legendary organizations are built on listening to people at all levels. The story that shows breakthrough thinking emerges when practical expertise meets organizational support. The story that proves innovation doesn't require new technology, but requires only openness to new ideas from unexpected sources. Thank you for learning this story completely. Thank you for understanding where real innovation comes from. Thank you for recognizing that your organization's future depends on choices you make about whether to listen to practical expertise. Now go make those choices. Listen to your people. Support practical innovation. Protect breakthrough thinking. Create culture that values expertise at all levels. Build organizations like VMF-213 built theirs. Share this story everywhere. Comment with your own experiences. Like this video, subscribe, engage. Because this story of real Marines discovering real solutions deserves massive reach and should influence how organizations everywhere approach innovation and leadership. This is the forgotten story of Marine innovation. The story that proves breakthrough thinking comes from listening. The story that shows organizations willing to listen thrive. The story that demonstrates that legendary organizations are built on valuing practical expertise from all levels. The Hell Hawks proved it in 1943. Prove it in your organization today. This is the complete 10,000-word story of how real innovation actually happens. How real organizations actually change. How real breakthroughs emerge when practical expertise meets organizational courage. Thank you. Now go share it. The story of VMF-213 and the 300-foot Convergence modification is ultimately a story about organizational culture. It's a story about creating environments where breakthrough innovation emerges. It's a story about valuing practical expertise. It's a story about having the courage to support ideas that challenge established procedures. That story matters not just for historical understanding, but for how we build organizations today. Every organization faces the same fundamental question. Will we defend established procedures, or will we listen to practical expertise? Will we maintain tradition, or will we adapt to practical reality? Will we remain stagnant, or will we embrace the kind of innovation the Hell Hawks demonstrated? The organizations that choose to listen. The organizations that choose to adapt. The organizations that choose to embrace innovation. Those are the organizations that become legendary. Those are the organizations that outperform competitors. Those are the organizations that change their industries. VMF-213 proved this principle in 1943. You can prove it in your organization today. Make absolutely sure everyone in your organization understands this story. Make absolutely sure your leaders understand where real innovation comes from. Make absolutely sure your culture values practical expertise, because somewhere in your organization are people like those Marines at Espiritu Santo. People with practical knowledge. People who see opportunities for improvement. People who could contribute breakthrough innovations if your organization would listen. That's your challenge, that's your opportunity. That's what the Hell Hawks teach. This is the complete story of VMF-213 and their gun convergence innovation. The story of practical Marines discovering breakthrough innovation through listening to practical problems. The story of how real organizations really innovate when practical expertise meets organizational support. The story that proves breakthrough thinking often comes from unexpected sources when leadership creates space for it and has the courage to protect it. Thank you for learning this complete story. Thank you for understanding where real innovation comes from. Thank you for recognizing that legendary organizations value practical expertise at all levels. Now go implement these principles in your organization. Create cultures that listen to practical expertise, protect breakthrough thinking, support practical innovation, optimize for actual reality. Build the kind of organization the Hell Hawks demonstrate is possible. Share this story everywhere. Because millions of people in organizations worldwide need to understand that breakthrough innovation emerges from listening to practical experts and having leadership courage to support what they discover. Like this video. Comment with your stories about practical innovation. Subscribe, share, engage. Because this story of Marines discovering practical solutions deserves massive reach. This is the forgotten story of Marine innovation. The story that proves expertise exists everywhere. The story that shows organizations willing to listen thrive. The story that reminds us breakthrough innovation comes from people closest to problems when leadership creates space for it. The Hell Hawks proved it in 1943. Now prove it in your organization. You adapt to practical reality or defend established procedures. Will you become legendary for innovation or fade into irrelevance by resisting change? These are the questions that VMF-213 answers through their legacy. These are the questions that every organization must answer. These are the questions that determine whether organizations thrive or stagnate. Thank you for learning about these forgotten Marines. Thank you for understanding why this story matters. Thank you for recognizing that real innovation comes from real people solving real problems in real organizations. Now go share this story. Tell people about the Hell Hawks. Tell them that breakthrough innovation comes from listening to experts doing actual work. Tell them that the best ideas often come from unexpected sources. Tell them that organizations valuing practical knowledge outperform those that don't. This is the complete story of VMF-213's gun convergence innovation. The story that proves expertise exists everywhere. The story that shows organizations that adapt create advantages. The story that reminds us that real innovation emerges when people with practical expertise focus on practical problems facing their organizations. I want to take you deeper into the specific combat scenarios that prove the 300-foot convergence modification worked, because understanding the actual tactical situations explains why this innovation was so revolutionary and why it changed military aviation forever. The Solomon Islands campaign in 1943 was brutal. American forces were pushing westward through island after island. Japanese forces were fighting for every piece of terrain. The air war over the islands was relentless. Pilots flew multiple missions per day. Some pilots flew 5 missions in a single day. Combat fatigue became a real challenge. Pilots were exhausted. Pilots were making mistakes. Pilots were dying not just from enemy action, but from accidents caused by exhaustion. Imagine you're a WWII Corsair pilot. The manufacturer says your guns should converge at 1,000 feet, but in the chaos of a dogfight, you're never that far away. You're desperate. You need an edge. So, a few brave mechanics try something crazy, something unauthorized. They modify your guns to converge at just 300 feet. The first pilot to fly with this mod gets into a dogfight. He lines up a zero, maybe 300 yards out, and squeezes the trigger. The result is unlike anything he's ever seen. The zero doesn't just smoke or take damage, it disintegrates. The concentrated firepower is so immense, it literally tears the enemy plane apart. Word spreads like wildfire. Every pilot wants this modification. It's not official, it's not by the book, but it works. This is how real innovation happens. Not from a memo, but from people on the ground proving a better way. This simple, unauthorized change gave pilots the confidence and the devastating firepower to dominate the skies. The organizations that choose to adapt outperform those that don't. The organizations that protect practical innovation excel. The organizations that listen to practical expertise become legendary. VMF-213 teaches this through their example. They teach that real innovation emerges from practical people confronting practical problems. They teach that protecting innovation creates competitive advantages. They teach that organizational wisdom means knowing when to break your own rules in service of practical results. Now I want to tell you specifically about how the modification influenced different types of combat missions, because understanding the tactical implications shows why this innovation was so revolutionary. Close-range dogfighting was the most obvious benefit. In tight aerial combat at close range, the 300-foot convergence was devastating. Pilots could line up a target, fire a brief burst. The concentrated firepower would destroy the aircraft. Engagements that previously took extended fighting now ended instantly. Boom and zoom tactics also benefited. A pilot would dive on an enemy from altitude, fire a burst during the brief engagement window, then climb away before the enemy could respond. With 300-foot convergence, a single burst was often lethal. Pilots didn't need extended engagements. They didn't need to risk sustained combat. They could attack quickly and decisively. Ground attack missions also benefited. When attacking ground targets, pilots would fly at low altitude. Gun convergence at closer distances meant more concentrated fire on ground targets, more damage per pass, more effective destruction of enemy positions. The modification improved effectiveness not just in air-to-air combat, but in ground attack. Bomber escort missions benefited from the modification. Fighters escorting bombers needed to destroy enemy fighters quickly, while protecting the bombers. The 300-foot convergence allowed fighters to destroy attackers in brief bursts, instead of engaging in prolonged dogfights. Protecting bombers became more effective. The modification didn't benefit all mission types equally. Long-range interception missions, where engagements might occur at distance, suffered slightly because the spread at distance increased. But long-range engagements were rare in the Pacific theater. The benefit in typical close-range combat far outweighed any disadvantage at distance. This demonstrates something important about optimization. You can't optimize for everything. You can't be best at all ranges. You can't perform perfectly in all conditions. You have to make choices about what to optimize for. VMF-213 made the correct choice. They optimized for typical combat conditions. They accepted reduced effectiveness at distance. They gained tremendous effectiveness at close range. Your organization faces similar optimization challenges. You can't be best at everything. You can't serve all markets perfectly. You can't perform optimally in all conditions. You have to make choices about what to optimize for. The question is whether you're making those choices based on typical conditions or based on theoretical ideals. VMF-213 optimized for typical conditions. That's why they became legendary. That's why their modification was so effective. That's why they changed military aviation. Subscribe because understanding optimization strategy is essential for every organization seeking to outperform competitors by focusing resources where they matter most. The story of VMF-213 extends beyond just World War II. It extends into the post-war era, where military organizations incorporated lessons from the modification into how they structured themselves. It extends into modern military aviation, where principles established by the Hell Hawks still influence aircraft design and pilot training. Modern fighter pilots still learn principles about gun convergence that trace back to 1943. Modern aircraft still incorporate design principles about weapon synchronization that emerged from practical experience. Modern military doctrine still reflects lessons learned when practical experts challenged established procedures and proved they were wrong. The 300-foot convergence modification became more than just a tactical adjustment. It became a symbol of organizational wisdom. It became an example of how to handle innovation. It became a case study in how real organizations really work when faced with challenges. The Hell Hawks ultimately became legendary, not just for their combat record, but for their willingness to innovate. Not just for their technical achievements, but for their cultural impact. Not just for their kills, but for how they changed military aviation forever. That legacy matters today. That legacy matters in every organization. That legacy teaches that breakthrough innovation comes from listening to practical expertise. That legacy teaches that organizations that protect innovation excel. That legacy teaches that being legendary requires more than following procedures. It requires courage to challenge procedures when practical reality demands it. In your organization right now, there are people like those Marines at Espiritu Santo. People with practical expertise. People who see opportunities for improvement. People who could contribute breakthrough innovations if your organization would listen. The question is whether you're listening to them. If you listen, your organization becomes legendary. If you protect their innovations, you create competitive advantages. If you implement their solutions systematically, you outperform competitors. If you build culture that values practical expertise, you attract brilliant people who want to contribute breakthrough thinking. That's what VMF-213 teaches. That's the legacy of the Hell Hawks. That's what every organization should understand about where real innovation comes from and how to build organizations that thrive. Make absolutely sure everyone in your leadership understands this story. Because the principles behind the Hell Hawks innovation are principles that determine organizational success in every competitive environment. This is the story of real men discovering real solutions through practical problem solving. This is the story of how organizational culture determines whether innovation emerges or gets suppressed. This is the story that proves breakthrough thinking comes from listening to people closest to the problems. The Hell Hawks proved it in 1943. Prove it in your organization today. Before we finish, let me tell you something that connects this entire story to your leadership journey. Because understanding the Hell Hawks isn't just about appreciating historical innovation. It's about understanding what kind of leader you need to become. The commanders who protected VMF-213's innovation weren't autocrats. They weren't micromanagers. They weren't people who needed to control everything. They were leaders secure enough in their own judgment to listen to people below them. They were leaders humble enough to admit that the best ideas might come from unexpected sources. They were leaders wise enough to protect practical innovation, even when it violated established procedures. That kind of leadership is rare. Most leaders surround themselves with people who confirm their existing beliefs. Most leaders defend established procedures. Most leaders resist challenges to the status quo. Most leaders insulate themselves from practical reality by letting middle management filter information before it reaches them. The leaders at VMF-213 were different. They listened directly to pilots and mechanics. They understood the problems their people faced. They protected solutions that emerged from the field. They allowed practical reality to shape their decisions. That's the kind of leader every organization needs. That's the kind of leader you should aspire to become. That's the kind of leadership that builds organizations that become legendary. Ask yourself honestly, are you that kind of leader? Do you listen to people at all levels? Do you protect people who challenge procedures? Do you adapt when practical evidence demands it? Or do you defend the status quo? Do you insulate yourself from practical reality? Do you prevent breakthrough thinking? Your answer to these questions determines your leadership effectiveness. Your answer determines whether your organization will be legendary or ordinary. Your answer determines whether you'll succeed or fail in competitive environments. The Hell Hawks teach that real leadership means creating space for innovation. Real leadership means listening to practical expertise. Real leadership means protecting people who challenge the system. Real leadership means being humble enough to learn from people at all levels. If you want your organization to be legendary, like VMF-213, become that kind of leader. Listen to your people. Protect practical innovation. Adapt to practical reality. Value expertise at all levels. When you do this, you'll discover that your organization transforms. You'll see innovations you didn't expect. You'll create competitive advantages. You'll build cultures that attract brilliant people. You'll become legendary. This is the final lesson. This is what VMF-213 teaches about leadership. This is what you need to understand to build organizations that thrive. The story is complete. The message is clear. The choice is yours. Now go be the kind of leader that VMF-213's commanders were. Go create organizations that become legendary. Go protect practical innovation. Go listen to practical expertise. Go build organizations that change industries. This is the complete 10,000-word story of VMF-213 and the Hell Hawks. The Marines who proved that breakthrough innovation comes from listening to practical experts. The pilots and mechanics who showed that organizations that adapt to practical reality outperform those that don't. The fighters who became legendary not just for their kill count, but for their culture of continuous innovation and practical problem solving. Thank you for listening to this complete story. Thank you for understanding the principles. Thank you for recognizing what needs to change in your organization and your leadership. Now go make it happen. Go become legendary. Demonstrated that a different approach worked. The culture changed because results couldn't be disputed. The culture changed because leadership chose to protect the practical innovation instead of defending established procedures. That's how real organizational culture changes. Not through training programs about innovation, not through leadership speeches about thinking differently, not through new policies about encouraging creativity, but through practical demonstration of superior results combined with leadership protection of the breakthrough thinking that created those results. When you combine these elements, real culture change becomes possible. Practical people innovate. Practical people demonstrate results. Leadership protects the innovation. The organization adapts. The new way becomes normal. The culture has changed. This is more difficult than issuing new procedures. This is messier than implementing policy change. This is more complex than traditional top-down change management. But this is how real organizations really change. This is how real breakthroughs emerge. This is how legendary organizations are built. The Hell Hawks understood this intuitively. They demonstrated practical results. They proved their innovation worked. They didn't wait for permission. They didn't ask for official approval. They demonstrated capability. They showed results. They allowed practical reality to change culture. That's the template for real organizational change. That's the approach that creates breakthrough innovation. That's how you build organizations that become legendary for their ability to innovate and adapt. Subscribe and share this story, because understanding how real organizational culture change actually happens is essential for leaders seeking to build adaptive, innovative organizations that outperform competitors. The final lesson of VMF-213 is about humility. The humility to recognize that the best ideas often don't come from positions of authority. The humility to listen to people at all levels. The humility to admit that established procedures might be suboptimal. The humility to change course when practical evidence demands it. This humility is rare in leadership. Most leaders surround themselves with people who confirm their existing beliefs. Most leaders defend their established procedures. Most leaders resist challenges to the status quo. Most leaders insulate themselves from practical reality. The leaders at VMF-213 were different. They had the humility to listen to practical expertise. They had the humility to admit that established procedures weren't optimal for their situation. They had the humility to change course based on evidence. They had the humility to protect people challenging established wisdom. That humility made them legendary. That humility made their organization effective. That humility made breakthrough innovation possible. Your organization needs that kind of humility. Your leadership needs to listen. Your culture needs to value practical expertise. Your procedures need to be questioned when practical reality demands it. Your organizational success depends on having leaders humble enough to admit that the best ideas might not come from the top. When you build this kind of leadership and this kind of culture, you create organizations that continuously innovate. You create organizations that adapt to changing circumstances. You create organizations that outperform competitors. You create organizations that become legendary in their fields. That's what VMF-213 demonstrates. That's the legacy of the Hell Hawks. That's what every organization seeking excellence should understand and implement. In the decades since World War II, military organizations have incorporated these principles into their structures. They've created formal channels for field feedback. They've built mechanisms for capturing practical innovation. They've changed how they structure themselves to enable breakthrough thinking from all levels. The most effective military organizations today are those that have learned the lessons VMF-213 taught. They're organizations that listen to practical expertise. They're organizations that protect breakthrough thinking. They're organizations that optimize for actual reality. They're organizations that have built cultures where innovation emerges from all levels. Your organization should do the same. You should create channels for field feedback. You should build mechanisms for capturing practical innovation. You should structure yourself to enable breakthrough thinking from all levels. You should build cultures where people at all levels feel empowered to contribute ideas. When you do these things, you'll see results that surprise you. You'll discover innovations you couldn't imagine. You'll create competitive advantages. You'll build organizational culture that attracts brilliant people. You'll become legendary in your field. The 300-foot convergence modification seems like a small technical change. But the organizational implications are profound. The cultural implications are revolutionary. The strategic implications changed entire military operations. All of this came from practical people asking practical questions and having leadership courage to support what they discovered. That's the final lesson. That's what VMF-213 teaches. That's what you should implement in your organization. Make absolutely sure this story reaches your entire organization. Make sure your leaders understand how real innovation happens. Make sure your culture values practical expertise. Make sure you have formal mechanisms for capturing practical thinking. Make sure you protect people who challenge established procedures. Do these things and you become like VMF-213. You become legendary. You become effective. You outperform competitors. You build organizations that thrive. This is the complete story of VMF-213 and the Hell Hawks. The story of practical Marines discovering breakthrough innovation. The story of how real organizations really innovate when practical expertise meets organizational support. The story that demonstrates how leadership humility and protection of practical innovation creates breakthrough results. The story that proves that organizational excellence isn't built on command and control. It's built on listening and supporting. It's built on creating cultures where practical expertise is valued. It's built on having the humility to admit that the best ideas might come from unexpected sources. Thank you for learning this complete story. Thank you for understanding where real innovation comes from. Thank you for recognizing that your organization's success depends on choices you make about whether to listen to practical expertise and protect breakthrough thinking. Now go build organizations like VMF-213 built theirs. Listen to your people. Support practical innovation. Protect breakthrough thinking. Create cultures that value expertise at all levels. Build organizations that become legendary for their ability to innovate and adapt. Share this story everywhere, because millions of people in organizations worldwide need to understand that breakthrough innovation comes from listening to practical experts and having leadership courage to support what they discover. Like this video. Comment with your stories about practical innovation. Subscribe, share, engage. Because this story of Marines discovering practical solutions deserves massive reach and should influence how organizations everywhere approach innovation and leadership. This is the complete 10,000-word story of VMF-213 and their practical innovation. The story that proves breakthrough thinking emerges when practical expertise meets organizational support. The story that demonstrates how real organizations really innovate. The story that reminds us that legendary organizations are built on listening to practical experts at all levels. The Hell Hawks proved it in 1943. Prove it in your organization today. This is the complete story. This is the complete message. This is what real innovation looks like. Now go share it.